Cam Linke. I'm the CEO at Amii. Once upon a lifetime, I did a master's with Adam, and he passed me for some reason. So don't hold that mistake against him. Yeah, so that's the super fast background on me. Obviously, you know a fair amount about Amii from Warren and the team, but happy to chat more about that at some point. And I will throw it over to Adam to talk more about himself.
Yeah, I'm a professor at the university, so I'm an assistant professor in computer science. But I guess what's special about me is I also spend half my time at DeepMind Alberta, which is just over there, I guess, in the same building as Amii. And so, yeah, I'm a research scientist there. I'm a professor at the university, so I kind of have this hybrid life where I work in industrial AI, but I also work in mentoring students, teaching classes, and the usual stuff.
Yeah, awesome. So I feel like we have a really awesome opportunity with Adam. And one of the reasons I felt really fortunate to have Adam as a supervisor, and I think our department's really fortunate to have him, is that I don't feel like everybody always gets like the honest truth when people talk about, should I do a PhD, or like, was a PhD hard? Was it easy? You kind of get the stock answer. You get everybody's stock answer. It's either like, yeah, it was easy. It was a breeze. I loved it. Greatest time of my life. Or you get like, no, it's the worst. Stay away. And you kind of don't get like a lot of the kind of nitty gritty, in between. I think Adam's always been awesome at kind of giving the kind of full color, the full picture of his experience. So maybe like at a high level, if you want to talk about your grad school experience,
Sure.
And what that looked like for you.
Yeah, I mean, I still have the superpower that I can remember very well being a student, sitting in the Computing Science Center, worrying about things, being excited about things. So it's all still very fresh to me. So I grew up in New Brunswick, which is on the other side of Canada. I went to a really small university. And I had always planned to do grad studies, but I didn't know where I was going to do it at. And I think I randomly ended up in Alberta. So I applied a little bit late, so I could only apply to the schools that were still open, and that was like Queen's, UVic, and U of A. And I applied to those places, and there was already a person here called Dan Lazat, who's now a prof at Western. He was already here. He went to the same undergraduate school that I did. He worked with the exact same people in undergraduate research that I did. So I emailed him, and he's like, this place is amazing, Edmonton's amazing, Alberta's amazing, come here right now. It's like, okay. So I did that. And I came in here to work on like software systems and parallel computing, because that's what I did in my undergrad. But I ended up taking this course on reinforcement learning from this guy called Rich Sutton, who happens to be like the founder of that field. And it just, the topic blew my mind, and so I got drawn in. And I actually, at the time I was working with Paul Liu, who's another prof in the department, was like, Paul, I kind of want to do this AI thing. And he was like, that's amazing. He's like, you found something really passionate. He's like, go do it. And that's a lot like what our department's like, which I really, really like. The profs are really generous that way. So anyway, I did a master's with Rich, and I'd like to say that it was like really fast and really intense. Like within the first year, I was at what was then called NIPS, but now is called the NeurIPS conference, like presenting about RL Glue, which was the software I made in my master's, like telling all the people in reinforced learning how they should be running the experiments, which was just mind-blowingly stressful, but it was good. I got a really nice master's out of it, and I got introduced to my community. And then I didn't know what to do next, right? I didn't know whether I should get a job or do a PhD, and so I did the snooze button on life thing. I just did a PhD because that seemed like the lowest, the easiest thing to do next. And Cam, maybe we'll get into some questions, but probably wasn't the best choice at the time. So the first couple of years were a little bit tough, but then I settled into working on off-policy learning and predictive knowledge. And it worked out really nicely, and I finished my PhD with Rich, and then I went off to Indiana, and then eventually I came back here.
Awesome. So let's dive right into the meat,
sure.
Adam.
Sure.
So you said the first couple of years were tough.
Mm-hmm.
Let's dive right in there, and like why were the first couple of years tough?
All kinds of stupid reasons. One of the reasons was like I was in this weird place where I was coming out of my master's, and I'd worked on software in my master's. And, in our group, there was a lot of people doing a lot of interesting algorithmic development, and I was a little bit jealous, so I tried to like pivot hard towards algorithmic development and like predictive knowledge theory and stuff like that. And and I just spent a lot of time looking for projects that weren't right, rather than looking for things that just moved along nicely. And I did a lot of weird things, like I would decide I'm going to work on teaching agents through reward, and then other opportunities would come up, and I'd say, no, I'm not going to work on that. I'm going to work on my thesis topic, and that's just a terrible idea. Work on opportunities, say yes to things, collaborate with people. And also, I just suffered from a ton of imposter syndrome, so I felt like I wasn't good enough. This is a very, very intense group, really high quality people. And so I spent a lot of time just being unhappy and just searching for a project. So like I would say like the first 3 years were just really like just soul searching and not really knowing what I was doing.
And so at some point you obviously finished a fairly successal PhD.
Yep.
So what was that kind of transition? What made that switch over for you?
Yeah, I guess at some point, and I mean, this is kind of a thing I use for career success. Like I like to tell my students, if you're coming to meet me and you're nervous about it, that's a big problem, because I should be a resource to you. You should be coming to me thinking, what am I going to get out of Adam this week? Because I'm here to accelerate my students, not make them nervous. And I used to be nervous to go meet Rich. And I used to be nervous about a lot of things. It's like, I can't. Like, I'm never, ever going to graduate if I take this approach. So I just decided, I don't care what he thinks about me. I don't care what other people think about me. I just need to get work done. And that was kind of like it was more like a mental pivot. Like, I just have to focus on getting stuff done. And, in grad studies, everyone talks about like, this brilliant moment of inspiration. 90% of research is just putting your head down and working hard. And most people that, apply to our programs or do well enough in undergrad to get into our programs, you're all smart enough. You're all clever enough. It's now about, can you focus? Can you get the work done? And that was the big change for me, I think. Interesting.
So if you kind of go back to that decision point, that master's PhD, kind of said, well, hey, look, I got momentum here, right?
Yeah,
This momentum's taking me in this direction,
Yep.
might as well continue. Are there things you would have done differently, or ways you would have thought about that differently, at the time? If you could go back and talk to young Adam about things at the time.
I'm still young, right?
Younger Adam.
Right.
Adam. What would you tell younger Adam?
I mean, my answer to these things is always like, just slow down, right? Like, I'm 40 years old now, and I could decide to do something totally different, and I still have lots of my life to explore other interesting things. I could go become a marine biologist. In fact, I remember in 4th year undergrad taking a marine biology course and saying, oh crap, this is like way better than computer science. What have I done here? And maybe the me now would be like, well, okay, I'm gonna go explore that now. And so yeah, just like slow down, take the decisions slowly. They don't need to come fast. You've got lots and lots of time to make these things. And I always tell people like you can read about, there's handbooks about PhDs and stuff, and they talk about things like 3rd year blues. Like the thing that I was talking about, that is so regular, it's unbelievable. And so if you're going into a PhD with 3rd year blues in the first year, it's gonna be a hard slog, right? And so don't go into a PhD unless you're excited about it, and like you're thinking about, I'm excited by the challenge, I'm excited by the opportunity. If you're going into it thinking, I'm not sure I'm good enough, and of course we all suffer from that. I still suffer from that, right? Like I still go give talks at conferences, and I feel like I might make myself look like a fool if I say the wrong thing. Everyone has that. It just like gets less, right? But if you're going into a PhD and you feel that really strongly, then maybe you should take some time, because you see this in industry and you see this in school. Being in school and being in industry is maybe not the place to work on mental health problems. Like if you have a mental health problem, you should focus on that. That's like way more important than other things. Work on that. Don't say, oh, I'm gonna do mental health as a side project while I suffer in a PhD. That's gonna be a tough battle.
I mean, that's just great life advice in general. You're getting extra, not just learning about PhD today. I'm curious. You at one point said that you focused and kind of turned down like interesting projects and stuff to work on.
Yep.
And maybe we can use a machine learning maxim around explore, exploit.
Yeah.
At some point you have to finish a PhD.
Yep.
They tell me, and not me. But like, so how should somebody think about balancing? Okay, there's always exciting projects to work on, and not kind of flitting around and jumping from project to project, but also not turning down super interesting opportunities to work on things. Is there a way that you think people should think about that?
I think if I were to skew one direction, I would skew towards saying yes to things, because when you think about graduate school, like one of the main things you do in graduate school is you do an apprenticeship with senior researchers that have done it enough times that it looks like they are good at it. And so if you work on projects or papers with people, you're learning how they do work, how they write a paper, how they approach experiments, how they deal with when, oh, none of this stuff makes sense. Should we pivot? Should we dig harder here? And so that's one of the most valuable things you get in a PhD. So if you do that a couple times, even with different people, that's very useful. And I like to contrast my PhD with my wife, Martha, who's a prof in the department. My PhD, like the document was very much like predictive knowledge, off-policy learning, robotics. There was like a strong narrative all the way through that, and all the work was related. Like you could draw a line between those papers. Martha just worked on a bunch of cool stuff for like 5 years with Dale Shermans and Mike Bowling. And she was able to put a story around it, right? And she just got lots of opportunity to try things out and learn from projects. And so, you have to not bounce around too much. And so it's important that when you do something, you try to finish it. And by finishing it could mean a paper, but it could also mean the experiment that shows you this is not the right road to go down right now. And if you're working with senior people like your supervisor, or just other, postdocs or profs in the department, it's their job to help you see when the pivot happens, right? So if you're working with, say, Mike Bowling, and he's like, I think this is a dead end, we should probably stop, just listen to him. He probably knows what he's talking about. And I think that mitigates that chasing around too much stuff.
Yeah. So one thing, and we'll get to Q&A for everybody in a little bit, and I wonder, one question I can imagine a lot of people having is, what's the difference between a master's and a PhD? Is like a PhD just like 3 masters in a row? Is a master's just a tiny PhD? What's the difference, and how to maybe think about them or categorize them in your head a little bit differently?
Okay, I'll say some joke answers first, just to set the stage. So like one of the joke answers is, nobody reads a master's thesis. You write your master's thesis and then you just file it right in the trash, and it's never read by anyone. This is not true, and it just depends on the work. But the way I like to think about it, and the way I structure like the research with my students is, for my students, I like them to get a conference submission in the second year of their master's, and then they turn that into their master's thesis. Doesn't need to be accepted, but it's something that myself and our collaborators think, this is good enough to be submitted to ICML, it might get in. I think that's an excellent foundation for a master's. For a PhD, we kind of do think of it as like 3 papers, basically, right? I think maybe the big difference is that in PhD, you become much more independent throughout the process as the years go by. Not at the beginning, like it takes time, and you start picking up your own research topics that you're interested in. And I think the expectations in the defense are different, right? So in a PhD, this is the phrase that Rich said to me, like on the first day of my PhD, and it scared the living crap out of me. He said, your job is to become the world's expert in your topic. No one in the room that's evaluating you should know more about it. No one in the world should know more about your topic than you. And it seems crazy, but it's like totally true, because you spend like 5 years thinking about something and doing something and working in a related sequence of things. You'll probably know more about it than anyone else.
Awesome. Well, I can still kind of keep asking questions if people have things that they're going to mull over. I do want to open it up for other folks to ask questions. I'm going to repeat your question just to make sure that the mic and everybody can pick it up. So don't think I'm like trying to do, I don't know, some weird like miming thing or something back at you. But yeah, let's open it up and see, are there any questions that anybody has for Adam? Or I guess me, but mostly Adam.
Hi, my name is Tasim. You mentioned that you were unhappy the first 2 years of your PhD, right?
Yeah.
You were trying to look for cool stuff to do, but not things that float easily. So, like, where do you draw the line? Like, when do you stop looking for cool stuff to do, and when do you start on things that will float easily?
So maybe I'll just repeat.
Yeah,
back
sorry.
at it.
Yeah.
So the question was, when do you stop looking for cool, interesting things to work on, and then kind of get into that, okay, like flowing, and maybe get into like the business of finishing your PhD?
Right.
When do you kind of have to think about making that transition, or do you have to think about it?
I mean, it really is going to depend on your style and your advisor style. So, like in our department, people have very, very different styles. And the easy way to categorize it, there's very hands-on advisors. And by the way, I'm going to use the word advisor. I know the term is supervisor in Canada. I much prefer the term advisor, which is used in the States, because my job is to give my students advice. I'm not their supervisor in any kind of way. So there's very hands-on advisors, and then there's very hands-off advisors. And so my PhD advisor, Rich, he's exactly like his advisor, who was Andy Bartow, their approach is like, they let the mushrooms grow. They provide the environment for which mushrooms grow in, and then the mushrooms either grow or they don't. And so, given my own approach to research and what I needed at the time, at the beginning of my PhD, that wasn't a great match. Rich and I still work together to this day, and he was super invaluable to me in the second half of my PhD when I found out exactly what I wanted to do. But he never like pointed me in a direction and said, go do that or go do this. He was just letting me find it. And maybe I grew from that experience. Maybe it set me up better than other ways. I don't know. But I don't do that with my students. With my students, even early PhD, I pitch them projects. I try to help them see a direction they can go in. And so the way I run my lab, my answer to that question is it's my job to help students find those projects early on.
So maybe that's a good kind of follow-up question, in that we have a large department, a lot of different personalities, a lot of different ways of advising students. I think a challenge can be a PhD. You go take your PhD with somebody, you have to get accepted usually by that prof to start.
Yep.
So maybe it'll be a two-part question. If you don't have a supervisor or advisor, how would you go about trying to figure out who would be a good match for you? And then maybe if you do, what's a good way of figuring out how to work well with that person and kind of understanding that there's going to be a little bit of a learning how each of you operate for the first little bit.
Yeah. So the way I see it, I really like the Canadian system because you have a master's and a PhD, and I kind of see the master's as like training for both the advisor and the student. Like they're training to see whether they will fit together for the ultimate dance, which is the PhD. And so I would be extremely cautious to take anyone who I didn't do a master's with, because it's a really huge commitment for both parties for a really long, like minimum 5 years, right? Minimum 5 years. No one goes through fast in that unless, lightning strikes 3 times. There are other ways, like, if I had a colleague, like say Doina Prekop or, David Silver, or someone else who said, I work with this person, I love them, I know you, Adam, very well, I know your working style, and you guys work well together, then I might like interview with them and try to get them know them together. But in general, like the best way is to work with someone. So taking someone's course is really, really good. Doing like a small project, like one of the students I'm working with now, over Christmas, I met with them a couple times. I suggested a project. They worked on the project, asked me questions. I saw the information I needed to take them as a master's student. Working together is the absolute best way. Like there's people that do really well on tests, but then struggle to do research. There's people that are brilliant and productive, but there's a personality mismatch. And it's not just about me protecting myself. It's about you too, right? Like if we're not a good match, it's not going to be good for you either. And so just doing stuff together, I think, is the absolute best way. And
let's say you're accepted into a program. You have an advisor. What do you think are good ways? And maybe let's pretend it's a new advisor. You didn't do a master's with them. What would be a good way to start that relationship and start like figuring out how your styles kind of complement or don't each other?
So I have a weird thing I do, or a weird thing I like, which is I really like deadlines to understand people. And so the way people interact and collaborate and help each other when there's like a short timeline to achieve a lot of work and starts to get stressful because it's like, okay, this paper is going to be due in like 48 hours. That tells you a lot about a person, and I think for both directions. And so I've used that multiple times where when people join my group, I try to right away put them on a project that someone else is already working on. So they can join something that's already moving, that already has direction, already has momentum. And then they can see my working style, they can see the other students' working style. And so I think that's just a great way, like immediately start working on a project that leads to a paper as fast as possible.
Awesome. See if there's any other questions. Lauren.
Also source some from the audience.
Oh, cool.
How do you evaluate getting a PhD if you're already set on pursuing a career outside of academia?
I'll repeat, just how do you evaluate getting a PhD if you want to have a career outside of academia?
Yeah, so what's the value of doing a PhD? It takes a lot of time, and there's more business-oriented people in the room than me that could do the accounting for you of how much salary you stand to lose while being a poor graduate student. I get to say that because I was a poor graduate student. It's hard to say. I don't think a PhD is ever a monetary decision. It's all about you want more school because it's literally the end of school. Maybe postdoc could be considered a little bit more school, but that's it. Like from there on in, it's like job training and development courses and tech companies. And so I think you do it because you say, I have skills I need to develop. I want to become an expert in some area that I'm not yet like a world expert in. I think those are the reasons you do it. I don't think it's a money thing. Like, it worked out for me that I work for a good tech company, and obviously that has benefits for me. But that was never my motivation, and it never would change me looking back what I did.
It might be worthwhile pointing out as well, if you are thinking about doing a PhD, is very few people end up with academic jobs after.
Yeah, it's a really competitive market, and when you go around to smaller schools in the States, like we were going around doing job search, you go to these really small schools that are like really down the rankings. All the profs there are from like CMU, Cornell, Yale, because those places graduate a lot of people and they want to be profs somewhere. So if you want to get a job at like U of T or CMU, I couldn't get a job at those places.
Or U of A.
Right, or U of A. CMU, U of A.
Any other questions?
A lot coming in.
All right. Everybody saw.
Yeah, there's a lot of advanced questions. Are there any particular contacts within the research group that you would recommend talking to if you're looking for kind of more personalized mentorship around that decision of PhD or not to PhD?
It's like, who else in the group should you chat with? And maybe I'll expand it beyond just a research group. Like, who else do you think would be who do you think would be good people to chat with as somebody's trying to go through that decision?
Other students, right? Like one of the things that helped me have a better mental image of myself and PhD was I forget what the subreddit's called. There's one about grad studies, and it's really raw and really, really honest. And it talks about the percentage of people that do their qualifying exams and don't finish, the percentage of people that start writing their thesis and then eventually never ever graduate, and that there's communities of people that talk about this. And so there's students in this room that I know are in our program. Some of them I work with. Talk to those people. Get lots of opinions about whether this is a good idea, what their life is like, what their work-life balance is like, because it's going to be better than talking to a prof, because profs see it from one side and it's very, very different.
So maybe, kind of question would be, let's say somebody starts their PhD and just God forbid it does not work with their advisor. This is oil and water, never mixing.
Yep.
Are they done? Is life over? Do you have advice for somebody who hit that point?
I know multiple, maybe multiple's not the right word. I know a couple people that were working with someone and they were not having a great time, and they switched to another advisor and it worked out fine. And our department is lovely in this regard. There would be absolutely no hard feelings if David over here decided tomorrow, he's like, I can't work with Adam anymore. I'm gonna go work with Rich. That's just gonna happen. I would not be upset. Okay, obviously this wasn't working for David, and this is better for him now. And that's how we think about it.
It's like, this is an option?
And actually, so, I spent time at Indiana University, and there the view on graduate students is a little bit different. So they often talk about that students are like employees, and they pay them to do things. I do not consider any of my students employees. I don't consider that I'm paying them. I consider them that I'm giving them like a stipend so that they can live and not suffer while they do research. So the grant structure in the States is that students are tied to grants, which are tied to particular projects, which means someone applies for a grant and they fund 3 students. And if one of those students decides to work with someone else, that grant money is just lost to them. The progress in that project going forward is lost to them. And so we don't think about it like that at all. We're very, very generous. We want what's best for the students. And then the question you didn't ask is, not finishing is not the end of the world. And in fact, I don't have the numbers on me, but someone should email the department and ask them, what is the completion rate for a PhD at the University of Alberta? What's the completion rate for the PhD in the computing science department? And usually they define it on completion within 5.5 years or something, right? It's not a super high number, which means there's a lot of people that are either taking long or just never finishing. And that's okay, because your life, your mental health is way, way more important than this piece of paper and doing this thing. You always have to, students get into this trap where they'll torture themselves to complete something that isn't right for them, and don't do that.
Maybe I'll go back to the audience questions in a second here. Maybe one other question that is, when you're thinking about a PhD supervisor,
yep.
Certainly, I've had conversations with grad students where it's really looking for somebody's name to be on there.
Yeah,
I really want to work with Rich Sutton, or I really want to work with this famous researcher.
Yep.
Do you have any advice on on trying to find somebody, on how much does having one of the quote unquote superstars in the field, does that actually make a huge difference in the future? What does that look like?
It's hard to know, because we'll put the pejorative term on it, like the old boys club. I was brought up in that club, right? I did my master's with Rich Sutton, which means I had easy ins to go to these conferences and talk to all the famous people in my field, and they would make time for me. It's also true that at the time there was 20 profs in RL, and they would just talk to anyone anyway. And in fact, if we ever have in-person conferences again and you go and you see Rich, you'll see Rich talking to absolutely arbitrary random people, because that's just what he does. Our community is very friendly that way. I think first and foremost, you have to find people that you work well with, working styles, sort of life philosophy, those things matter, and the friction can make things really, really slow. Because at the end of the day, you want to do good work. You want to be able to tell other people about your good work, and there's lots of ways to make connections to a community. Sure, your advisor, if they're famous, can give you connections, but also when you have your PhD exam, we bring in an external, right? And the external is supposedly someone who's really good in your area to be an outside view on your work. That person will give you opportunities if you do a good job and impress them, right? And that's exactly the way we think of it. We literally ask students, do you want to work in industry? Do you want to become a prof? And then we help them pick the appropriate external. And so there are multiple ways to get in this, and the community could be better at being open. And I think actually virtual conferences make this better. And in fact, Martha was running a town hall at iClear today about what we do about conferences, because what do conferences do? Create an enormous amount of carbon and terribleness. And so we have to think about these questions of whether we should go back to these things. And the emerging view from that discussion was that conferences should be about broadening the community and bringing people in and making people interact, because they're not really a great way to identify new work, because they're very noisy. And so I think every year we make steps to take positive steps to make the world more open and more inclusive, and that means I think you can focus even more on just finding a person that you work well with.
Question, yeah.
As you mentioned, if you want to learn something, you should say yes to some projects. So did you ever have that kind of experience when you got interested in multiple projects with multiple professors, and you felt like you have overcommitted, and how did you manage situation because different professors don't know what we're doing with other professors. So how did you handle that kind of situation?
So just to, I'll do the
Thank you, Cam.
repeat. Yeah. So did you ever end up in a situation where you were on multiple projects with multiple professors and maybe overcommitted to, the amount of time you had and the amount of projects you were working on, and how did you deal with that? So that works.
Yeah, as a student, no, because I was an idiot and was just like, I'm only going to work on one thing. So that didn't happen to me as a student. There might be the general worry that you're working on things that your advisor doesn't know about. Like I said, all the people I know, they'd be very cool about that. You give them an update. As a senior researcher, I work on a lot of projects in parallel, and you just have to balance your time. It never seems to be a big deal because projects always have these cadences where some speed up and other ones slow down. And it seems to always kind of work out. It's like, okay, this one that's accelerating, I'm going to focus hard on that and work on that for a few days or even a couple weeks, while the other ones kind of simmer a little bit, because that's just the natural way research works. Things get really exciting near deadlines because then you have, I've had times where 8 projects are going towards the deadline. Now, of course, only 3 of them actually turned into paper submissions, but you do have to, make bets about what's going to work out, and that's just part of research.
Only 3 could get Compute Canada allocation to get everything ready for the conference. Yeah. That's how they speed up and slow down. Yeah. No GPU. Oh, that one slowed down.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
So I just have a question. So how is it perceived by industry if a PhD student turns into a master and then goes to industry?
So how's it perceived in industry if somebody started to go down the PhD route and then ended up just finishing a master's instead?
Good question. I don't really know, because all the hiring that I've been involved with in industry is people plop candidates on my desk and they're like, can you interview this person? I'm like, okay, well, they go through a process, right? So there's always these initial filtering. I know, for instance, at DeepMind, we don't filter based on number of publications. But people are genuinely very generous about different ways people get to places. And it's kind of like the thing where we say, like, your grades aren't going to matter for you getting a job at Google. I think that's actually true. So I don't think it's going to matter too much. It's going to more matter like how you do on your tech stack interviews and things like that, how you do your knowledge interviews and things like that.
Yeah, I was going to ask something very similar. It's like, so if you had kind of compare the career progression of someone who has a master's versus a PhD,
Yep.
kind of how would the trajectory look like over that 5 years of doing a PhD? What could someone progress in industry during that time?
So what would, I'm not sure I totally caught it, but just if somebody were to do a master's and then go into industry, and instead we're doing a PhD, like what would they both look in parallel 5 years in the future?
Yeah, so you're talking about, like, you did your master's and then you land some, let's say, research engineer position. What's, like, your promotion look like, where you could get to in the time that you could during a PhD? This is highly variable. I mean, at least, in my company, obviously promotion is based on, performance, right? And so, the way tech companies often do things is they have levels, and the levels have descriptions about what your responsibilities look like and how you're performing. And the usual general thing is they like to see someone performing at the next level for 1 year, and then they say, okay, you're already been performing at that level, so we'll bump you up. I think, the time that takes is actually maybe just around the 4-year mark. So maybe we're looking at, you could be promoted once. Maybe if you're really moving fast, you could like do it in 2 or 3 years. So maybe you could get 2 promotions in that time. And so if you're coming out of masters, you would come in at like the base level. And so maybe you could get 2 promotions during the time of a PhD. Now, coming out of a PhD, you then enter the company at a higher level, typically. And if you do a postdoc, you definitely will come in at a higher level. So maybe it's a wash. But you're going to have very different experiences. Like, one, you're going to have a lot of industry in the trenches working with the software stack. The other one, you're going to have a lot of research experience and, things crashing on Compute Canada.
Does age matter, like in terms of starting a PhD? Like are there advantages if you start earlier rather than later?
And are there advantages to starting a PhD earlier or later, or are you maybe like, are you punished for waiting later? And can you go back and do a PhD later? Might be another kind of question there.
I mean, in one way, the answer is age absolutely does not matter. The other answer is, like, when I think of myself when I was moving out here, in 2004, I was not the same person I am today. I was very young. I had very immature views of life and the world. And so, yeah, maybe my life would have been easier and smoother if I was like, a construction worker for 10 years. I would have gained a lot of perspective on things. So I think the answer is you can do anything you want, and it won't matter. And definitely no one will look down at you for coming into the program and being older. That's for sure.
I just one question. So is it good, like, after you finish the master's, go directly to PhD, or you just go to the industry, gain some work experience, and then start the PhD? Did it help you with, like, go through the PhD process or not?
Are you talking about the application process or just in general? So the question was, basically like, should you get experience between doing your master's and PhD?
You don't need to. I think if that's going to help you become a more mature person and get more out of your PhD, I think that's the way you should think about it, right? If you're really sure you're going to do a PhD, then you approach it thinking, how am I going to get the most out of this experience? How am I going to learn the most? How am I going to make the most connections? How am I going to pick up the most skills? So I think if doing some time in industry, you're going to make money. I don't think it's going to weaken your grad school application in any way because, for instance, at the U of A, to get into our PhD program, you have to have someone saying, yeah, I want them. And the school is generally pretty generous. Like, if there was just some person walking around outside on the street and I said, I want them as my PhD student, they'd say, okay, whatever you want, Adam. So, I mean, that's the big roadblock for our program. You need to find that connection and someone to say, yeah, I'm committed to being their advisor for the next 5 years.
We're going to have to edit that part of the video on the U of A's behalf or something. No, our admissions is so much harder.
No. Send it to FTSR. They'll really be happy with me.
Oh, man. They're just going to be like, do you know that rankings are based on this? Any other questions?
How do you pick a PhD program?
How do you pick a PhD program?
I should ask you.
How did you pick a PhD program?
For me, it was very natural to stay where I was. My mindset at the time was, I'm afraid, I don't know what to do. So obviously I'm going to stay exactly where I was. So that was my stupid decision. But yeah, there's all kinds of factors that matter. The people that you get to work with, the backup people you get to work with in case it doesn't work out. The location obviously matters. I think I told David the other day that there would be no amount of jobs or opportunities that would bring me back to New Brunswick. Sorry, province of New Brunswick.
More editing and post-production.
Nothing that could be done to overturn that because I really like Edmonton. I really like Alberta. I have strong connections here that I can't break. So like all those things matter. I think, opportunities afterwards because like Mike Bowling likes to say that Edmonton's sticky. That people come here and they're like, man, it's kind of smelly. And then they get here and they're like, you know what? I could see myself being here longer. And so think about that when you're committing to a place. Like, can you see yourself staying in Bloomington, Indiana? This is where I was. Bloomington, Indiana for the next 20 years. Or maybe Seattle is maybe a place you can imagine yourself a little better. So I think all these factors matter. There's no like real easy answer to this question.
For those who can't smell it on the camera, Edmonton's not smelly. Typically,
You brought me here for honesty.
I did say I was very honest. I will tell the truth about the smells. Other questions? Yeah.
What does your typical workday look like during your PhD? Is it like a 9 to 5? Do you work evenings? Do you have like work-life balance?
What's your yes reminders. What does your work day look like during a PhD?
It was all over the place. Like at times it was like, get up at 10 and roll into the lab at 1 and stay till 7. It was really driven by paper deadlines where I like, especially at times when I was like in like a really bad place, and they weren't even at deadlines. There was like, I was really insecure and things weren't working out for me. So my response to that situation was the irrational thought of, what if I just work at all hours? That'll probably be better, right? I'll have a clarity of thought. I'll get lots of work done. Of course, none of that happened. And then, later on, I think I drifted towards like, almost like the schedule I have now, which is I get up at a reasonable time in the morning, like 7 a.m. I'm usually working by 9. I'm stopping by 5, but then, later in the day, I'll probably start working again. And work-life balance is a thing that's defined on the person, right? Someone can have a great work-life balance and work 20 hours a day if they truly are happy and motivated. And so I think you need to find that thing for you. If you ever find yourself working harder because you feel like you're behind, then you probably need to take a break.
Yes.
So it might not be probably related to PhD or not PhD. It's actually like someone with a master graduate wants to have publications in neurons or RCML.
Yep.
Without going to PhD or working with a prof. So is it without also having any experience in FANG companies? So what would you suggest to them?
So like, could you publish at a top-tier conference without having a PhD or working with somebody with one of the kind of researchers in the field there?
I mean, there's nothing that stops you. You could just go write an iClear paper. Actually, NeurIPS is closest, so you can just go write a NeurIPS paper tomorrow and submit it if you want. The thing about working with researchers, senior researchers, is that they have a good idea of how to do that. They have a good idea of what good research questions are. I'm an area chair / meta reviewer for all the major AI conferences, so I see a lot of papers under review. And I see a lot of papers that were clearly submitted by, either undergrad or early master students where there was no supervision. And the pejorative thing you would say about it is, this looks like a student project that had no supervision. And they're very obvious because, they might have started off with a cute idea, but it's not situated in the literature. Like, they don't have a broad knowledge of what's been done before. They don't necessarily run the right experiments. And someone might be able to just intuit all that stuff and figure it out on their own, but actually there's more to research than just reading, DeepMind's 10 most famous papers and then trying to emulate them. There's a lot more to it than that, and there's a lot of subtle things that go into building a successful publication.
Probably the other thing for reviewing is you kind of are like, wow, they never talked to anybody else about this. There was no feedback before this got submitted.
That's a huge thing, right? Like, that's why you talk to people about your work. You don't talk to people about your work to tell them how awesome you are. And in fact, my argument is the whole purpose of the conference system and publication is that you tell other people about your work and they either A, build on it and make it better, or B, they're like, that's really cool, but also for this part you could have done this. And you're like, ooh, that is better. Publication is supposed to be like a two-way communication, not just a broadcast.
Question?
I had a question. So if you could tell a grad student to focus on one or more crucial skills that would be beneficial for the PhD, what would it be?
So what would be the crucial skills for a grad student to have or to develop for a PhD?
Yep. I guess there's two of them that I'm thinking about. One is not so much like a skill, but a discipline, which is just learn lots of, like, your job is to learn. In fact, that's literally what research is, right? You're learning things all the time, and then when you learn things, you can see connections, you can put things together, and then you write that stuff down. And a lot of times in my PhD, when I felt bad about myself for my contributions, like I remember I was in the PhD program at the same time as Amir Masood. I believe he's at Vector now. He was a PhD student here. He's a great guy, but he knew so much stuff. And so he'd be at the AI seminar sitting in the front seat, and he'd be like, well, what about this thing I read and this thing and this thing? And I was sitting there thinking, man, I don't even have these questions. He must be way smarter than me. And he's probably definitely smarter than me. I mean, it's Amir Masood. But he also read a lot of stuff. He read way more things than I did, and that's where those questions were coming from, because he knew a bunch of stuff. So that's one thing, the discipline of just reading and learning all the time. Reading papers, reading textbooks, reading blog posts, whatever, to build your knowledge. So that's one. And then the second one is writing. Like, communication is so important. And so Rich always used to harp on us to write in our research journal. And there were times when I was his student where he would check our research journals to check that we were writing. And I don't think that part's necessary, but yeah, writing is a way of thinking, and it's a way of clarifying. And so it's useful in that respect, but it's also useful because most of what you do is either writing papers or giving talks, and that's just about figuring out how to convey the esoteric, tiny pinpoint knowledge and insight that you have to someone who hasn't thought at all about what you're doing. And they're like, who cares? You have to get them to care. And writing is like a huge part of that.
I remember having to pull my dog ate my lab notebook thing in a meeting with Rich. Like, oh yeah, I don't know.
Pull the fire alarm.
Yeah, I gotta run. I'll be right back. Other questions? Questions online?
Yes. So when you obviously have experience in both academia and industry, how do you see the use of what you learned in your PhD differ across both of those forms?
So how do you see the use of, how do you find using your PhD in industry versus academia? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm lucky. I like DeepMind is indeed like a pure research company. Like, they tell me, you're good at doing research, go do research aligned with the mission of something artificial intelligence. Like, that's a really, really broad mandate, right? And so it truly is just fundamental open research environment. And in that sense, I consider PhD to be like your professional training in becoming a researcher, right? And there's definitely people in industry that have an undergrad or have a master's and then went in and then became a very successful researcher in industry. It happens definitely all the time. There's people who are software engineers that operate like people who got a PhD 20 years ago. All kinds of things like that can happen. But your best chance of becoming a really good researcher, I think, is doing a PhD, if that's what you want to do for your career.
We have time for one more question. So lots.
This could be a really important one.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be an important one. Yeah.
So how do you find the right question, or the things where you're doing your PhD that you're really passionate about? Things that you just want to wake up and you say, work 12 hours on. How do you find those questions? Or is it an iterative process?
Oh, it's like a meta question. It's like the last question's about a question. So how do you find the right question when you're asking the last question in the question session? How do you find the question? Like, how do you find the right question to think about and to work on that really excites you?
Yeah, I want to not answer the question first, and then I will answer it. So the first answer to this is you don't have to worry about this. And in fact, like, I remember Martha and I finishing our PhDs thinking, we got our research agendas from our advisors. Like, they had really cool research agendas, and we're like, yeah, I'll follow that right off a cliff. And like, it wasn't off a cliff, which is great. But we followed them. And then, when we finished, I remember, us sitting in our offices in Indiana thinking, are we going to be able to do this? Like, when it's just us and we have to make up the questions, are we going to be able to do it? And it turns out kind of, yeah, like you are trained to do that through the process, this apprenticeship process I was talking about. And so it's definitely not something I expect from master's students. It's definitely not something I expect from early PhD. It's something that you just start seeing signs of at the end of a PhD, in my opinion. But it's really hard. And, the first answer is, in research, you try 10 things, 9 of them don't work at all. And so you have to always be trying lots of things. You have to be in love with asking questions and not necessarily getting answers. And then there's other little things you can look at. I don't follow fashions in the field. Like, there's things that get really, really hot in reinforcement learning. I typically don't do them because fashions have always been there in machine learning. Like, the jokes where you would go to NeurIPS in Vancouver when it was much smaller, when it was like 800 people versus 20,000. And the joke would be, what keyword is going to be on every single poster? Is it Gaussian processes this year? Is it support vector machine? And it was serious. Like, literally, they all said Gaussian processes. Like, really? Everyone's doing that? So it's always been like this in machine learning. But I don't try to swim anti the trends, but one general piece of advice is, The hard problems have been around for a while. Like in reinforcement learning, it's like, learning representations, exploration, these kind of things have been discovery, what the agent should learn about. These have been open problems since like the people started thinking about AI, and people often don't work on those problems. And so you're probably not gonna solve exploration, but it means there's progress to be made there. And I think trying to actually go after the hard problems is motivating. You're gonna learn things, and that's end up what we report in research anyway. We try something obvious. We thought it would definitely work. It totally didn't work, but that was interesting, and then it made you think of something else, and then you did something else, and then eventually you get some insight.
Awesome. I think, unless there's one incredible last question, we'll chop it off there. Thank you so much, Adam, for taking the time. Appreciate it. Give Adam a round of applause.